Are you interested in learning how to use and calculate the exposure time for a 10-stop neutral density filter, known in some circles as the big stopper? If you are, then this is going to be the tutorial for you. My name is Julian Elliott. I'm a professional landscape and travel photographer. If you're interested in keeping up with what I do as a professional photographer, then make sure you click on the subscribe button in the bottom right hand corner, just down there. As I said, there's a number of different areas that you can use your 10-stop neutral density filter. This is one such place. The reason I've chosen to start here is we're going to be concentrating just on an exposure reading for the entire scene, because we're not having to deal with a foreground exposure and an exposure for the sky, which we're going to be coming to later on. Now, when it comes to creating your images here at a waterfall or anywhere with your 10-stop, there's a few things that we need to go through before we even click the shutter release button. So put your camera on the tripod and then get your composition. Focus the lens. Once you've done that, make sure that the autofocus button is not on. As soon as that 10-stop filter gets on the front of your lens, the lens system will start hunting around trying to find where the focus point is. Then put on a cable release. So you can see I've got a cable release there. And then lastly, put the camera in bulb mode, because we want to see how many seconds are counting down on the exposure itself, as it could be we're going over 30 seconds, as here, for example, is quite low light at the moment. And then lastly, cover up the viewfinder of your lens, because that will let in additional light and you then actually may get light leaking in to your final exposure. So that's just a couple of things that you can do before you even click the shutter button when using a 10-stop neutral density filter. As you can see, I've set up my camera in front of this gorgeous waterfall here in the southwest of the United Kingdom. Now what I've done is I've taken an exposure reading from a very dark area by the side of this waterfall. Now I've done it in spot. And the reason I've done that is I want a more accurate exposure. So when I took a spot meter reading from the back of the waterfall, it said it was around a half second when the meter was on zero. So when it's on zero, it's trying to render that very dark area as a mid-tone, but I actually want it as a black tone. So if I take off 2 stops, it becomes an 1/8 of a second. So that's the base exposure that I want, the overall exposure that I want for this particular scene here with this waterfall. Now I have taken an exposure reading with a polarizer on the front, so it's rendered the scene how I want it with the polarizer in place, because the polarizer is not going to affect any of the exposure readings at all. And the next step is obviously to add on the 10-stop, and we need to work out how long is the final exposure going to be. Now, a lot of people I know will say, well, why don't you just use an app on your phone and it will tell you immediately what it is the exposure is going to be. The problem with the app is, what happens if your phone battery's dead, you left the phone in the car, your missus chucked the phone out the window, your dog ate it, you're knackered if you've forgotten the phone, or any of those different scenarios. So it's always a good idea to learn how to calculate the exposure manually. So 10 stops up from 8 seconds. Now let's count it. So it's going to be base exposure of 1/8 of a second, and then 1/4 of a second, a half a second, 1 second, 2 seconds, 4 seconds, 8 seconds. Careful, 15 seconds, 30 seconds, 60 seconds, and then a final exposure of 125 seconds for our exposure of this gorgeous waterfall here. Now if you notice, when you're going up above 8 seconds, the exposure increments actually mirror the exposure in increments when you're actually going quicker than 1 second. So if you're going below 1 second, it's half a second, quarter, 1/8, 15th, 30th, 60th, 125th. So you'll notice they pretty much mirror all those seconds that I explained. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to get my 10-stop neutral density filter, put it on the nearest slot on my filter holder, and then I'm going to take that final exposure, then I'll show you what 125 exposure second looks like with this beautiful waterfall here, the southwest, the United Kingdom. So that's the first example that you can use a 10-stop neutral density filter in, a waterfall. Now I chose a waterfall just for the simple reason that we've only got one sort of area to worry about doing the exposure reading, because we don't have the sky to worry about. We can cut it out in our exposure, although you can, from this area that I'm in, you can see the sky, but it's not really worth including at the moment, so I've left it out. Now, as I said, if you've watched a lot of my vlogs, I don't really like doing water for very long at all. And I do believe that here, this is an example, personally, where I find that 2 minutes, 125 seconds is maybe a bit too long, really, because the white that's there at the bottom of the falls is just too white for me. Although it's correctly exposed, it's just too white. But some people like it, some people don't. The Marmite effect. But in any case, let's move on to another example of how we can use a 10-stop neutral density filter in landscape photography. Another use for a 10-stop neutral density filter is here when you've got an open landscape, such as here at Pilston Pen in Western Dorset. Now I've chosen today because you might be able to hear there's a lot of wind around, but there's also cloud. So the method that I'm going to show now is whereby we're going to add some movement to the cloud. So obviously the wind is going to be pushing the cloud when the exposure is running. Now, something I would say is that I see a lot of images that have these very long streaky clouds. Personally, I don't really like it too long. I just want it enough, because I feel that subtlety is the key here when you're doing a long exposure with cloud. Sometimes it can look just a little bit silly, like someone's taken a smudge tool in Photoshop and just gone straight across the image like this. It just looks a bit silly. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you how I'm going to set up the image itself as far as getting the exposure, the base exposure, and then from there what I'm going to do is add on the 10-stop, and then we'll see the before and then the after image using a 10-stop neutral density filter here in the landscape of Pilston Pen. So how am I going to get the base exposure for this particular long exposure here at Pilston Pen? Well, what I'm going to do is I'm going to meter the foreground and then meter the sky, because normally at this time of day, it's around 1 o'clock in the afternoon or so, there's going to be a brightness difference between the foreground and the sky. Now, I have done a whole tutorial on neutral density graduate filters, so if you want to be able to look in the top right hand corner up there, then you should see a flyout menu that leads you back to that particular tutorial. Now I'll show you what it is that I'm going to do. So my camera is on, I'm going to put it on multi-segment mode metering, so it's going to give me an average across the whole of the area I'm going to meter, and then I'm going to meter up in the sky. So I'll just measure the foreground. It says the foreground is 1/60th of a second, so that's going to be our base exposure. I'm then going to meter up in the sky to see what the difference is, and then that will tell me if I need a grad or not. So it says it's around 1/250th of a second, so that's 2 stops below 1/60th of a second. So that means I'm going to need a 2-stop grad to hold back the light in the sky. So that's the first step to achieving our long exposure. Get your base exposure just without any neutral density filter, and then we'll work from there. The next obvious step is to take the image without the neutral density filter in place, just to see if the exposure meeting that I thought it was going to be is the exposure meeting I'm going to need. So I'll just take that image before I move on to the next step and show you how to get to 10 stops above 1/60th of a second. So if I just look back at that image, I can see there's a tiny bit of overexposure in the white up in the cloud, but that's okay. it's fine. It says to me, if I also then look at the histogram, that everything is in place as I want it to be. So that's the base exposure without a neutral density filter in place. Let's move on to the 10 stop in place and see what we can do with that cloud up in the sky and see if we can give it a bit of motion. Now that I know my correct base exposure to work from, I now need to calculate the 10 stops above that exposure to see what the correct exposure is going to be with the 10 stop in place. So at 1/60th of a second, which is the foreground and is the exposure that's important to me, I'm going to count up to 1/30th, 1/15th, 1/8th, 1/4, 1/2, 1 second, 2 seconds, 4 seconds, 8 seconds and 15 seconds. With the amount of wind that's around, that should give enough of motion blur in the clouds up there to give the image just that little bit more interest in the sky. So let's put the filter in place, get the image and then see what it looks like. For this final segment of the 10 stop neutral density filter, I'm here at Kimmeridge Bay on the South Dorset coastline. Obviously one of those famous places on the Dorset coastline that people come to, and I've come here specifically today because it is a grey day and I want to combine both the seascape with the grey sky up there. Now you may be thinking, what on earth is he doing? He never shoots in conditions like this. Well, the 10 stop neutral density filter is ideal for conditions like this, because where it would normally be a photo that people would look at and go, what on earth are you doing? Why shoot there? The 10 stop will give us a bit more interest in the final image. So I'm going to do the calculations that I need for the base exposure, then I'm going to apply the 10 stop and then we'll see what that final image gives us for the 10 stop neutral density filter tutorial. This is how I've set up my camera to get that final 10 stop neutral density filter image. So at the moment you should hopefully be able to see on there my camera, it's f11 quarter of a second ISO 100. So if I take an image right now, it doesn't look all that interesting because it's just too quick, the shutter speed really. So I want to lengthen it and see what that will do. Obviously that's what we're here for, the 10 stop neutral density filter. So if you calculate 10 stops beyond a quarter of a second, it comes in at 250 seconds, which is 4 minutes and 10 seconds. So at 4 minutes and 10 seconds it should provide a bit more interest in the image. The sea's going to be flattened out and also those clouds will have a lot more movement than they've got right now. So let's get that 10 stop added on the front, get the final image and then let's go from there. The 4 minutes and 10 second exposure is over. I've got the final image here at Kimmeridge Bay with the very moody sky up there and obviously the sea has been flattened out. So that's how I would use a 10 stop neutral density filter in this particular scenario. What's next? Well, there are a few other tutorials that I want to do revolving around the 10 stop neutral density filter, but I'm not going to do them here in the United Kingdom. I'll probably do them elsewhere just to add a bit of difference to what it is that I'm doing. Hopefully you've enjoyed and seeing how I use a 10 stop neutral density filter. Now I'm just going to say, I know people are thinking, well, which one am I actually using? Is it the big stopper? Is it a high-tech filter? Whichever ones there are out there, Nissi, I think it is, all these different 10 stop neutral density filters. It is a Lee 10 stop IRND filter, I believe it's called. It's a very new filter that's come out, and the great thing about this particular ND filter over their original big stopper is that there is no color cast when you put it on. So the big stopper was very famous, of course, for having that that blue color cast. This one does actually has no color cast, which is amazing. So it saves a lot of time trying to faff around in post-production. So that's it for this particular vlog on how to use a 10 stop neutral density filter. There's a few other things coming up before the end of the year, probably 2 or 3 things I could think of that I can be doing. So until then, thanks again for subscribing. Thanks to all the new subscribers that have come on board in the last month or so. I know there's certainly been a lot of you that have come on board. I'm very grateful to all of you that are coming on board and liking what I'm doing. Please keep all those comments coming. I do enjoy reading your comments and reacting to them and getting into conversations with people. So until the next time, I'll see you later.